Hi, everybody. It's Deirdre Fay, and I have been, I'm using a new system right now, so I'm not quite sure how it's all working. So one step at a time here. Andrea writes, so grateful for you. And Deirdre, thank you, Andrea. Loving having you as part of my healing team. Perfect. That's so nice. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is what a lot of people on the Safely Embodied Learning community have been working with. We're working the 7 fundamental pieces of attachment, healing those needs and bringing them into our current life. The first one is around safety and safeness. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to start it off with one of my teachers long time ago, teacher, still a teacher to this day, a man named Dina Bandhu Patsarli, who has really helped me a lot through the years, and certainly in the early years when I lived at Kripalu, he was one of the founding members there and continues to be one of my big teachers. Recently I was talking to him and I said, how can I just trust, trust period, but behind that is trust that it's going to be okay, right? That it'll work out. And he was so kind with me. And at one point, he didn't laugh at me, but he was with me and it's saying, well, what we can do is be with ourselves when the things happen. And he said, that's why we practice. We use the term sadhana in yoga as the idea of doing our spiritual practices. And he said, that's why we do our sadhana. It's so that when we fall into the ditch, and we will at some point do something, and he calls it the ditch, we fall in, we don't fall as long, we don't fall as hard, and we know how to get out of it. And to me, it was like a little bit of pressure was eased, right? It's like, I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be on all the time. I don't have to do it right. Like I can be in process rather than complete. And I hear this from so many, the comments I get, the emails I get, the feedback I get on all of the websites and the courses is that there's this fear like this. Somehow we have to have it all together. Somebody wrote me recently, and the shame, he was talking about being exposed and having people see that he doesn't have it all together. And yet none of us do. But what we do have is the capacity to let ourselves be with what is as it's happening. And that actually may be the foundational truth about healing, is that we can be there with ourselves, that we don't have to separate off from ourselves in order to be there. So the difference really between safety and safeness is, one is a physical safety, knowing I can be in a physically safe location and that I'm not going to get physically hurt. And then safeness is this other component really essential to attachment healing, is knowing I'm psychologically and emotionally safe. Those two pieces are so simple, aren't they? And yet they're complicated. And what I am hearing from people who are working with this a lot is hearing how hard it is, how confrontive and how challenging the idea of emotional and psychological safety can be. So I get that. And especially if we haven't known or had a felt experience of safety or safeness, it feels hard to conjure it up. And yet our task is really to do that, and to find in simple everyday moments places where we can have some safety, and most of us have that, but have the safeness, which is harder. And part of the reason we don't have that safeness is because we're at some level reliving through the filters of our past experience this present moment. So this moment shows up, and inside us we don't feel safe, but the moment is actually safe. It's just that the pattern, the parts are driving the internal conversation, the internal feeling state so much that we can't be with what is going on outside. I don't know if this is making sense, and I would love to hear your comments. So post any comments that you have as I'm saying this, because it is complicated to untangle and to make more sense of it. I don't know if I'm speaking too broadly here, but it seems to me that we really need to have this emotional and psychological safety in order to really continue our healing. But what stops that is what we spent in the learning community the last month looking at, is the whole notion of the developmental task. And I think if there's one thing that's essential to know to frame healing, is this idea of the developmental task, which is that as a child, our developmental task is to get ourselves from outside. Somebody out there is mirroring who we are, and through that mirroring process, we actually get who we are inside of us. That's how a child, an infant, develops a sense of self. Now, if we don't have that, or whatever way we're getting mirrored back, is how we're informed about who we are. It's how we're imprinted by the external world. Now that then affects us as we grow up. And John Bowlby, the grandfather of attachment theory, talked about this as our internal working models. That imprint then becomes how we interact with the world. It's the lens through which we see the world and interact with it. So our task as an adult is to clear that mirror, that filter, so that we can see ourselves differently and experience life differently. There's a researcher, Lisa Feldman Barrett, who writes about emotions and researches emotions, and it's really important work. She talks about how we are constantly constructing our world. We can't not construct our world, and that our past is forming that construction, and that if we want to have a different life in the present moment, we need to look at how do we reshape how we construct this moment. So if I'm feeling unsafe, or if I'm numbing out, that's my preferred strategy, is to numb out and shut down, or maybe my preferred strategy is to get anxious. We can have a whole range of different preferred strategies to deal with our experience. Whatever that is, I have to begin to notice, oh, look at how often this happens. This must be my strategy for dealing with it. And as I deal with it, then how do I learn to clear it and change it? And that's, so much of what all of my courses and teachings are all about, and I will get more into that over time. So the challenge is to learn how to be with that. A, to notice that we're getting triggered and activated. B, to separate it out so that we can realize that in the moment I'm being affected by what's gone on in the past. That this moment is not necessarily, this gets so confusing and convoluted, it's not necessarily part of the truth. That sounds, but we're being the truth from the outside is being shaped by our internal experience. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who's trying to change her relational pattern and find a different kind of relationship. And she's finding that her strategy has been to be anxiously trying to figure out that other person so that she can feel safe. And it's so hard to find and learn how not to do that kind of anxious trying to figure out the other person. And so she's learning how to sit in her own skin, not be as responsive to whatever happens outside, so that the outside happens and something pings her, and the first impulse is to do something right away, just to calm herself, ensure the connection is still there. And she's learning how to just sit and stay steady inside herself and see, well, how does she really want to be? And that takes time, and it's a little bit complicated. Does this make sense? Are you guys all, I see a bunch of hearts and everything there, so thank you. But it's really important to me that it also makes sense. So our task is, how do we learn to sit inside our own skin, knowing that the outside is there and that we do want to stay in relationship with the outside. But how do we stay inside ourselves first, know what I think, I feel, I want, I need, and then be in relationship with other people out there. Thank you, Andrew. It's saying it makes perfect sense to me. It's always good to have some feedback. So that's what we're looking to. Now, somebody said recently in one of the comments, well, maybe I'm not strong enough to provide that kind of safety to myself. And I would say, with almost everybody I've ever worked with over all these many years, we are all capable of that. We might have to learn how to do it in smaller bits and micro bits so that we can learn how to make those stepping stones. And often that's what friends, mentors, colleagues, coaches, therapists are all about. All the courses are all about, is how do you break down something into more and more manageable bits so that you can take those steps. Carlin Lyons-Ruth, who's one of the big researchers in infant and child development, talks about scaffolding, that we're providing this scaffolding so that one step can be taken after the next step after the next. And that's what we need to do, because we are all capable of doing that. It's just that we have all these internal tapes or parts or voices, memories, I call them time capsules of experience, that are inside of us saying, well, I can't really do it. I can't. I'm not able to. And we have to recognize that's the disidentification. That's the separation that happens in internal family systems. We call that unblending. We need to be able to look at that and saying, oh, there are those parts that are saying I can't do it, that it's not possible. And yet it is possible. But I have to first recognize, A, that I am triggered or reactive, that the past is flooding in to the present, and then how do I unbind that, unblend that, and look at that. This part wants me to know how bad it was at some point. Really, that's what's going on. This part that's saying I can't do it, it's not possible, it's trying to communicate something in really the only way it knows how. And it's doing it and saying it in a way that trying to let us know this is how bad it was. So the listening is different. It's not that we're listening to this part who's saying it's not safe now or this person isn't good. As truth, we're listening more to that part saying this is what it was like. This is how bad it was. And in doing that, we might be able to land more inside of ourselves. And this makes sense from a different perspective, which is really what we're doing here. We're finding a different perspective to be with ourselves. Rather than getting caught up and loaded into that old state, we're actually being with ourselves and saying, oh, wow, this is really important what you're telling me, right? This is really important. So there's that piece of you are strong enough, learning to untangle yourself from the part that's saying I'm not, to be able to be with yourself, that you can. And you might need help, and you might need encouragement and motivation. All that's true, but of course you can do it. We can all do that. And how do I do it in a way that makes sense? And then recognize what I talk a lot about is the turbulence at crossing that boundary. Anytime you or I or anybody does something new or different, we're going to have some level of anxiety. It's going to be different. Something is going to happen. You're going to have anxiety, depression, frustration, irritation, envy, jealousy, I don't know, or a combination of all that. Anytime we stretch outside what's comfortable, something different will happen. And it's learning how to recognize, oh, there it's coming up. There's that turbulence. And recognize it as turbulence, not as something that's saying to us we shouldn't go forward with it, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And there's a few other things I can always talk. I can talk on and on sometimes. Let's see, it's been about 15 minutes. So if you have questions, let me know. If not, I will say one other thing, and it's in response to somebody who wrote about the workshop, the upcoming workshop I'm doing I think it's in May in Toronto, on embodied attachment. And somebody wrote and said, well, I'm interested, but I don't really want to do yoga, which I can understand. But here's the thing. The thing about yoga is not a thing. I guess really in essence for me, what yoga is about is a philosophy of psychology of transformation. And from everything I've studied, and I've studied a lot over all these years, I haven't found a model or a frame that's as good as yoga at describing the transformational process. And then there are skills within that, little movements that you can take or breathing practices that help move the process along. But yoga itself is really that psychology of transformation. Pretty powerful one. It certainly helped me literally change my life in dramatic ways. But it's helped so many other people that I've seen, and the people that I've worked with, and the people that I've worked with who've worked with other people. So it's if you don't like the idea of taking on a different philosophy, that makes sense. You don't have to. It's not like studying anybody, or really you don't have to study anything. It's more laying out the framework for transformation and then trusting that process along the way. And my guess is the more I talk about the psychology of yoga, which I want to do more of, the more you'll find that it relates and that it fits into your models, that there's a common denominator that I think yoga named maybe more precisely than others, but that can be used within any other tradition or framework. So that's my news of the day, and total pleasure to be with you. And I am going to try, I have parts of me that say, oh no, scheduling one more thing. But I'm going to try to do this more often, because I feel like so many people say so many good things that I want to be in relationship with you around. And because it's so important to know that we're not alone on the journey. I know that was really essential for me in my process, to know that I had community and support, and that actually helped me be able to hold and be with the process. So helping to create that is something that's important to me for you. So till next time, next week at this same time, noon Eastern time. Until then, I'll talk to you.